Welcome to the International Writing Program's weekly panel at the ICPL. I am Hugh Ferrer. I'm happy to welcome you here. I'm sorry for the late start. We're going to blame the rain. The world of arts is today's panel. I am going to, we're going to do a survey of how arts are connecting to various regions and aspects of life around the world. I'm going to do it a little differently today. I'm going to introduce each panelist before they speak. So I'll introduce the first panelist, Rumena BUZAROVSKA, and then I'll step out, and then I'll come back and I'll introduce people as they come. Writer, literary scholar, and teacher Rumena BUZAROVSKA of Macedonia spearheaded Macedonia's answer to the Me Too movement, which translates to I'm Telling Now. And in 2016, Literary Europe Live named her one of 10 new voices from Europe. BUZAROVSKA's 3 books of fiction have been translated into several languages, and her story collection, Moyat Maj, which won the Edo Budisha Award for Best Short Story Collection in 2016, will be released in English in 2019 as My Husband. Please welcome Rumena.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here. I feel like a star. Everybody's taking pictures of us. All right. It is difficult for me to speak of the art today in a global sense, as truly the art I am in touch with, and there are limits to this contact as well, nearly exclusively encompasses the art of the Western world. What I would be slightly more competent in addressing, though, would be the trends in art in my country, Macedonia. I do not expect many people in this audience to know much about Macedonia, even about the Balkans, except the regular associations with war. I feel like I should provide some context for the audience, but I fret as I write this because someone will undeniably get angry about how I present my country's complex history and identity. Not in this audience, but. I will only say that Macedonia first gained statehood as part of Yugoslavia after World War II, and gained full independence after the fall of Yugoslavia in 1991. We are a landlocked country with disputes with all of our neighbors, the most famous one still being the name dispute with Greece. We will have to change our name into the Republic of Northern Macedonia if we want to be part of NATO or the EU. A year ago, we managed to get rid of a scary authoritarian government, famous for the biggest wiretapping scandal in Europe, and its monstrous architectural project, Skopje 2014, in which the capital was transformed into a Las Vegas-y, monument-riddled, nightmarish architectural representation of a constructed identity. This madness incarnated in architecture cost 600 million euro worth of taxpayers' money. The project played on the insecurity of the average Macedonian and their overwhelming inferiority complex. Due to this complex of inferiority, I feel that my fellow countrymen suffer from an impulse to internationalize their work in the hopes that one day they will escape from the country and become famous in America, the land that they think they know from television, commercial products, and more rarely, books. We have become the victims of Halloween and Valentine's Day, adding 2 more holidays for the largely impoverished population to feel frustrated about. Instead of dropping the trend of acquiring the husband's last name in marriage, women are more and more resorting to acquiring the male-gendered version of the husband's surname. In other words, the grammatically incorrect, but fashionable and internationally understood version ending in ski, whereas I'm ska, for instance, just for clarification. Amidst debates about saving the Macedonian language from the Albanian language belonging to the large ethnic Albanian minority in Macedonia, written and spoken language is becoming increasingly riddled with transliterations from the omnipresent English. Toddlers who have been given 2-syllable names that sound like Greek or Roman numbers count in English first and learn the English names of colors before learning the Macedonian ones. As a side note, their parents do not know and will probably never learn how to count in Albanian. In the seedy little fast food booth in my neighborhood, I hear teenagers speaking American English to each other over diluted ketchup and soggy fries. Instead of using the juicy abundance of domestic swear words, they will rather use the F word in either expressing annoyance or amazement. My students come back from their work and travel trip to the US and consider it glamorous to insert 20 likes in every sentence and then end it with a question mark. The trend of aiming to make their work sound universal is something that we have seen in Macedonian literature, especially in contemporary poetry. It seems that the young and middle generations of poets favor an escapist mode of creation. They seem to reside in a bubble, far away from the post-socialist transitional corrupt era of independent Macedonia, a bubble where love reigns supreme. They may have inherited this from the past generations of adored, mostly male poets, where nature, woman, and the godly writer-creator are the main poetic subjects. In prose, it is thankfully a little different. The novels and stories of post-war writers are mainly dark depictions of cruel rural life during the war, something in line with regional literature that still references the experience of the Yugoslav Civil War. The new generations have now moved away from the trends of escapism or rural war stories to critical renditions of experiences that reflect the spirit of our time. I could not agree more with Flannery O'Connor, who implies in her essay, Writing Short Stories, that the general should be shown through the particular. Like her, I do not believe that anything meaningful can emerge if the local idiom is ignored. What she says in this essay continues to be my guide. When the life that actually surrounds us is totally ignored, when our patterns of speech are absolutely overlooked, then something is out of kilter. The writer should then ask himself if he is not reaching out for a kind of life that is artificial to him. Thank you.
We are going to move through all the panelists' presentations to get the conversation started, and we'll have questions at the end. Thank you, Rumena. That was great. Bayasgalan is a leading force in Mongolian letters, using literature to combat the systematic sexism she sees around her and founding a publishing house that aims to broaden representation in literature. In 2017, she received national recognition for her work to change the culture. A fiction writer and poet, Bayasgalan focuses on post-Soviet themes and takes a postmodern approach to depicting traditional Mongolian nomadic culture. She has also published 12 books of translation from English to Mongolian. Please welcome Bayas.
Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you for having me. Historical and political contexts and the shared sense as a nation under those circumstances influence a nation's art and literature far beyond what we can imagine. If we look back on Mongolian literature, we will see the vivid traces of our history and political progress as we experienced them. To give you a specific framework for my talk today, I will highlight some historical milestones of Mongolia and how those milestones are reflected in our national literature. At its beginning, Mongolian literature was just about our kings, about their glorious victories, their wisdom, their bravery, their grace, when they were most powerful in the 13th century. During that period of time, all literary works were written in favor of the kings. Under the influence of their power, perspectives of ordinary people were almost invisible in our ancient literature. Then the Mongol Empire, scattered because of centuries of fighting internally for state power, the Mongol Empire began to lose its dominance to the neighboring Manchu dynasty. During the 17th century, Mongolia became a semi-colonial country under the Qing dynasty, which is same as Manchu dynasty. At that same time, it embraced Buddhism as its main religion. National intellectuals became religious leaders and began to write religious literature, mainly in Tibetan instead of writing in Mongolian. Meanwhile, when we were losing our state power to an extrinsic influence and our national intellectuals to another foreign religious impact, the voice of suffering ordinary people began to be heard in the abandoned field of Mongolian literature. The main themes of the works written by ordinary folks were resistance against Manchu dynasty, anxiety over losing their freedom, their kings, and nostalgia for the times they were powerful as a nation. Another important milestone of our history was at the beginning of the 19th century, when our people started to fight for independence. Military commanders with civilian roots took the state power and purged political and religious feudalists completely, which resulted in the executions of thousands of Buddhist monks, national intellectuals, and leaders. In 1924, Mongolia declared its independence, and under the direct influence of USSR, the Soviet Union, it embraced socialism as its path of development. During the Soviet regime, Mongolian literature lost its freedom again and fell into a rigidly disciplined state censorship. The literary movement, which rose up in search of freedom and independence, ended up becoming a weapon of political propaganda. After being strictly controlled by the Soviet Union for 70 years, in 1990, Mongolia became a democratic country for the first time in its history. In this revolutionary reformation, centuries of lost pride, fragmented identity as a nation, hidden anxiety, and all the political pressure could be shed at last. With the newly obtained freedom, we could feel ourselves as individuals, not a part of mechanism. Could we express our true selves, tell the naked truths of our own lives without the covered layers of political prejudices? Share our true feelings as human beings, which were pressured to be hidden from the start under the power of glorious kings, under the pressure of extrinsic vandalism, under the chaos of revolutionary periods, under the control of borrowed ideology. We could have. But strangely enough, our contemporary literature was abandoned again. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed and we released ourselves from their control, all the people hurried back to the glorious periods of their history to restore their lost pride as a nation. Instead of embracing new ideologies of freedom, they took a long trip back to our history, back to their old values, which were prohibited during the socialist era. Nowadays, almost 70% of national bestsellers and award-winning books are historical novels or fiction works set in history. However, the values these works of art re-explore from the past are at odds with the values of our newly enjoying democracy. For most of these writers, democracy was never a true democracy, but just a chance to go back to searching for the lost identity of the nation in our history. Maybe after the centuries of extrinsic pressure, we lack the confidence to consider ourselves as people whose personal feelings are worth to telling. people whose own lives matter. Maybe we are trying to rebuild that confidence in ourselves by wielding the ancestral pride from our history. Maybe. Sometimes in this cultural climate, I feel like I'm a kid left in home alone, cooking some soup on the electronic stove, while my parents have gone to the forest to collect firewood, never to return. But I do know that the kid has to survive, and her story is worth telling. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our third presenter is Faisal ODDANG from Indonesia, who's the author of 4 novels, 2 poetry anthologies, and a short story collection. His 2014 book, which we transliterate as From One Heaven to Another, won the Jakarta Art Council's novel competition and then was named Best Novel by Tempo magazine. Other awards include an ASEAN Young Writers Award and 2017's Prose Writer of the Year from Tempo magazine. He is currently working on a translation of the Sulawesi epic Lagaligo, the longest poem ever written, and also a folk tale of the Bugis people, a marginalized community about whom I think we will hear more now. Please welcome Faisal.
Check. Check. Can you hear me? Hello. The birth of stories. I was born 24 years ago in a small village called Tale, in South Sulawesi province of Indonesia. The first language I learned was Bugis, my mother tongue, which we use every day at home as Bugines. I studied Indonesian as the official language when I was in elementary school, and lastly, studied Arabic and English. My story is a complicated language learning process, and I believe most Indonesian writers go through it. Even though I finally write on all my work in Indonesia, as I learned the language, I kept asking myself, how do I represent Indonesian literature? Indonesia has about 17,000 islands, 652 languages, and thousands of tribes. How can anyone simplify that diversity into a single identity? Perhaps answers lie in the history of Indonesian literature. The history of Indonesian literature cannot be separate from the civilization that shaped it. Indonesian literature originated from the oral tradition, born from spells and prayers used for rituals, worship, and other mystical things. Entering the modern era, the political function of Indonesian literature is especially significant. Starting with the Balai Pustaka era, Balai Pustaka is a publisher established for political purposes. Literary works had to be in accordance with the provision of the Dutch East Indies colonial government. Around 1945, the year of Indonesian independence, prose and poetry served to drum up the spirit of resistance to colonialism. In the Suharto regime, many writers were repressed, kidnapped, and disappeared until recent years because literary works could affect the political climate so powerfully. I provide this brief history to show that every place, time, and civilization creates literary works regardless of the obstacles. Speaking of the relationship between writing and obstacles, during my first 2 weeks in Iowa City, I got red tornado warnings on my phone and was screened in the lobby of my hotel. All the international writers were directed to take a shelter in the basement. In my village, we also have tornadoes. We call them the penis of wind. Yeah, you can imagine the shape. So I don't need explain the reason behind it. In America, people face tornadoes with sirens and warning. In my village, we face the penis of wind mystically. Okay, thank you. My ancestors believed nakedness is one of the ways of preventing tornadoes. So for America, you can do what I do in my village. Yeah. You don't need to take a shelter in the basement. If we treat the tornadoes as an idea on the brink of being written, then we can clearly see how the America way and my Indonesian village way of creating literary works are different. In addition to the brief literary history of Indonesia, I want to speak about my childhood and how my literary works are born from the things that I experienced. My village is far from the city and will not be found on the map. Because of our distance, there is no entertainment for us, no internet, no television broadcast. My childhood entertainment was just listening to a bedtime story from Dad, or climbing one of the many mango trees in front of our house with my friends. My father forbade me to climb a tree at the time. He said, "You will break the branches. The tree will be in pain and cry." At the time, I believed what my father said, and I believed the tree could talk, be sad, be happy, and cry. In 2012, I started studying Indonesian literature and decided to become a writer. I wrote novels, short stories, and even poems about trees and won various awards. As I continued to write, I realized that I was composed of various stories, including reproduced stories from my childhood. I have now written 4 novels, 2 poetry collections, and 1 short story collection, and I believe that works are recycled stories that shape my body, from music that I hear, books that I read, my discussion with other people, and of course, from the bedtime story with Dad. For a more complex context, my story is only a small fragment. There are still thousands and even millions of writers with different backgrounds, and all of them are parts of Indonesian literature. I believe that everyone has stories like a set of puzzle pieces in their body. Indonesian literature is a vast puzzle itself, represented by pluralistic civilization. It cannot be simply have a single identity, because Indonesian identity is diversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faisal. Our 4th presenter, artist Roberto ECHETO, works in the visual arts and radio in addition to being a writer and poet. A founding member and teacher at the Instituto de Creatividad y Comunicación in Caracas, ECHETO has published 3 short story collections, a novel, and 2 books of essays. He writes and edits for journals, writes scripts and produces for radio, and in 2015 he won the Cultura Urbana, which is a mixed media contest for his piece transliterated as Elementary Maneuvers. Please welcome Roberto.
Hello. I'm sorry. The shape of a new world to come. 4 and fast reflections on arts. 1. Since Cave of Altamira, the arts have been in crisis. In that ancient era, a cave artist painted a bison, and trust me, another caveman immediately criticized the painter because that image was too different from the original bison, or because the birded critic wanted to see other animals depicted on the walls. We modern humans don't know what bison signified to those early artists, but we can interpret. We assume the paintings are about the animals which humans could hunt and eat, and what food meant to our earliest ancestors. This is my first of 4 theses. When we speak about the arts, we speak about shapes, colors, and lines and we discuss the relationship between those compositions and reality. Art forges a link, sometimes hidden, sometimes clear, with the real world, specifically with issues of survival. When that link remains obscure, problems occur. Maybe what the prehistoric critic really wanted when he penned the first bison painting was just to eat more than bison's meat every night of his life. 2. Recently, I've been reading the cultural section of El Confidencial, a Spanish newspaper. I found an article about a man who went to a museum in Oporto, Portugal, and plummeted into one of Anish Kapoor's works of art. Anish Kapoor is a contemporary sculptor whose work investigates space, structures, and materials. The sculptor, the gentleman fell into wasn't a typical piece of iron or bronze positioned in the middle of a white room. It was a circular hole in the floor, which was painted in Vanta black, a very dark and opaque substance invented and patented by Kapoor and his associates. So a man went to Portugal, visited the Serralves Museum in Oporto, and sometime during his quiet promenade, he trod on an artwork which he saw as nothing but a spot in the floor. Then he fell down and down and down and ended up in the hospital with some wounds. Why didn't he watch his step? Maybe he didn't notice the vacuum in the floor because Vanta black paint is so dark. Maybe he was ignorant, as a lot of people are, about how to move through a museum, how to walk among artwork from different centuries and places, artwork made of delicate materials. Maybe he didn't know he was even trampling an artwork. Maybe he has always ignored the fact that art can be near, behind, beneath, above, inside us, without signals or landmarks. By the way, the title of the Kapoor sculpture was this 60-year-old man fell into is descent into limbo. 3. Art is dissolved in our lives. From Altamira to Andy Warhol, we recognize styles, ideas, movements, and even artists as real, with stories that are more or less recognizable. These stories, besides the work, are what we go to see in museums. But since the 60s, or maybe since the 70s, visual artists and the work they make haven't been able to achieve the same levels of recognition. Why? Do you think there are no more artists in the world? Some people offer socioeconomic explanations for this phenomenon. They talk logically about changes in the ways we produce, consume, and trade aesthetic or artistic works, and about modifications in our art viewing sensibility due to the speed of social media. And it's easy to agree with those kinds of arguments until the apocalyptic pundits arrive and declare the end of beauty and sensitivity. I don't understand it. I don't like it. I hate it. These are common comments people make in front of contemporary artwork. They ignore the intention of the artist, which they consider cryptic and shallow, and then announce a kind of abandonment. However, the same people are addicted to the pleasure they get from Facebook or Instagram, exchanging photos, creating memes, writing silly messages about any issue, giving likes and more likes to their friends. They live unaware of something so obvious. Our interaction on social media is only the grammar of our time, while contemporary art is the language of our future. We live in a world which was intuited by the artists of the past. The idea of an aesthetic stimulus hidden in normal life and not limited to the borders of any work or material which might as well be the definition of social media, comes from Marcel Duchamp and has been enriched over the decades by artists like Joseph Beuys and George Maciunas. Maciunas and his colleagues in the Fluxus movement created the basic language which we can use to understand our relationship with ephemeral material or websites, memes, photos, jokes, and even fake news. One of the missions of the arts is to imagine the future. This future will be realized with or without public recognition. And 4. In some ways, art always embraces us. We have to live with eyes wide open because an aesthetic stimulus or a story could be anywhere, in a cave with a hungry and burdened and grouchy man who will become the first art critic of history, or in a Portuguese museum where a man fell into Kapoor's limbo and thus started in his own unconscious happening. There are the masterpieces in every era and discipline. There are too the imperceptible gestures, the moments life can be twisted ever so slightly into new meaning. Art, ladies and gentlemen, is in us. Art is in life. Art is life.
Thank you, Roberto. I have a feeling I would want Kapoor to be on my bison hunting team. So, very good at it. I was going to start the questions off with circling back to the beginning and a question for Rumena. You cite Flannery O'Connor, a hometown hero here in Iowa City. We have a slightly darker quote on our streets from her. I wanted to know whether or not, insofar as this idea that you can't get beyond a certain level of identity without becoming inauthentic, that you are, how did you phrase it exactly? Let's see.
I didn't cheat it, but
I've got to get the right page.
artificial. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
The writer should then ask himself if he is not reaching out for a kind of life that is artificial to him. And to your sense, how far out can one reach?
Well, also that essay does talk about how sometimes writers get immersed in their in just the particular, and that even that is not too good. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it becomes a cliche, and I've seen that happen also in our culture, where certain films or books, even music, becomes so identifiable in terms of what people expect from the Balkans or our culture, that even that becomes a cliche. So I think that, you know, obviously we were also talking, you and I, a little bit before this about where do you draw the lines. It's very difficult to draw lines, obviously, but I think that the intention should not be, I'm going to write something universal. And very frequently you see this, and it really stinks. And you can sense it, but you can't really put your finger on it and say this is where it comes from. But I just think that you shouldn't run away from your experiences, or, you know, the way that in which you speak. And that's why I mentioned the naming, because that's artificial in the sense that they're trying to not sound, not behave like what their culture is in order to be accepted abroad. So not, you know, it's some kind of a balance between the two, I guess.
Great. Did others want to respond to the same idea about how far out you can reach and still not become artificial?
For you?
No.
Sorry, I don't get you. So I think it's also for Rumena.
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Sorry, I don't get you because I...
Oh, well, then maybe not. By the way, a microphone will go around, so if you have questions, please generate them. But I was asking, Rumena was making the point that if you go too far beyond, or you can reach artificially beyond yourself very easily. Do you have a sense of that, and do you think that there's a natural limit, or that the global culture is so permeating at this point that it's hard to know where those lines are.
Yeah, well, I think my point is we have a different case. I have a different case between
Sure.
Romena and me, I guess. But the most important obstacles for Indonesian writers or Indonesian works, or Indonesian literary works, is because we have to pass many stages. We have to translate our works. We have to translate into English, because all of Indonesian writers is written their works in Indonesian language. Then we have to translate it into English to be reached from wider readers. That's, I think, some more things that I can see as an obstacle for my works.
Is there questions?
It seems like, can you hear me? It seems like all of you are saying culture plus history equals literature. And I want to bring in an example of African American literature. Richard Wright's Native Son. I don't know how many of you have read his Native Son. It's quite an old book from the 40s. But Richard Wright, how literature can come into life. Richard Wright's Native Son and the murder of Molly Tibbetts. I don't know if you heard about our local crime. Well, and then too, we have Roberto ECHETO. He wrote a book about a Catholic church. I can't remember the name of it. Anybody remember it? Yeah, the name of the Rose and the Catholic Church scandal that's going on now. So how our art comes in to our present, because we're dragging our history with it and the culture. So is it the connection between culture, history, and that equals literature?
Can I ask? I think every artwork is it's a door, okay? A door to the past, to the present, and to the future. An artwork, maybe a musical piece or an essay or a picture, breaks down the present, okay? You can analyze a part of your time with an artwork. This is the sense, the real sense of an artwork. I insist, a picture or music or whatever. And you can look to the past, looking the artworks from a determined time, okay? Do you understand me, or?
Me too.
And are you agree? My colleagues?
I think there was communication there. I think the question was, yeah, so I mean, I think there was a question about whether or not the historical works of art and how they represent culture get pulled along so that they appear in modern culture. And you're saying that every piece of work opens up time, not only backwards, but also forwards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
This question is for Baya. When did the Mongolian nation adopt the Cyrillic alphabet? And is Russian among educated Mongolians still quite common? Mongolians of a certain age, knowledge of Russian language and influence from Russian literature.
Sorry, my horrible English. When we declared our independence in 1924, we got so much help from Russia economically and politically. So we embraced their regime and their political ideology and also their culture. And I think it was in the 1930s, we borrowed their Cyrillic alphabet. Before that, we even tried to borrow Latin alphabet. And then we decided to borrow the Cyrillic alphabet. And it created so much chaos in the literature because we have an old Mongolian script, which is from the beloved to, which I have written from the upper to the beloved, yeah. And so the way we pronounce our words in that old script is so different from the way we are writing our words in Cyrillic. So it was so confusing for that time for ordinary people of Mongolia, but also the writers, And with the Cyrillic alphabet, we also took Russian culture and literature, even architecture, in our life so much, and their influence was very great, even in our ordinary life. And even some writer decided to write a letter to Gorky, a famous Russian writer, asking how we write modern fiction. Can you teach me the way to modernize our Mongolian literature, something like that. And Gorky wrote back a letter to our writers, and that was the first ideology of modern literature in Mongolia. And we sent so many students back during the Soviet era to Russia. So they studied literature, film art, and also technical majors in Russia. And when they back to our home, they also brought their culture and ideology. So, but nowadays the Russian influence is less. Because our youngsters idolize Western world or America, and only old people who studied in Russia back in socialist era know Russia, and our youngsters are learning English.
So,
thank you.
yeah. So, I wanted to ask, because tying directly to what Faisal was just saying, so in our international literature today class, we're always making the argument that writers always pay attention to what is happening elsewhere. We always make the argument that even though the literature may be local, no writer does not read, and especially not in once the digital world has covered everything else. So you were making the argument. All these years. Okay, thank you. After all these years, so you think that. So I'm curious about how you would want, after you've staked out the territory for the local, how much do you feel you cannot help? You need to pay attention to what is happening elsewhere in other literatures.
From me?
Well, no, all of you, definitely. All of you.
I'll go first.
Good.
You have to, and as you say, it's something that you cannot avoid because you're reading and you're watching films, and then also that has an effect. Obviously, music and theater, and especially television nowadays. But I'm making the point of just combining, and I think that's what really gives the work its, let's say, I really hate the word originality, but it gives its special flavor. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just going to blend into something already that we've already experienced elsewhere. So, absolutely, you have to follow the
I didn't
trend.
necessarily even mean normatively. I meant, where do you feel that in your own work,
Oh.
you catch the vibe, from
I'm
elsewhere?
always catching the American vibe. And sometimes even when I write, I see nowadays that I'm taking, that my sentence structure is American. And then I write it in Macedonian, and then I translate it into my head into English and see if that works. And then when I do that, and then I translate it back into Macedonian in my head so that I can see that it actually works in Macedonian again. It's so kind of like a back and forth translation in my head. And obviously, I love American short stories, and then I see the flavor of these American short stories flowing through my work, and I love that. But then again, I'm not going to write about Stacy or, that kind of thing, which happens. That's why I'm criticizing it, because it happens so much back home. In our-
Maybe it is my turn. Actually, I want to divide my answer into 2 points. The first point is based on my view as writers, and the second point is based on my view as readers. It's two different things, I guess. Actually, on my works as writers, on the first point, I always bring a local issue in my works, because I have a personal purposes. Actually, I want mostly, if you read, I don't think so. If you read Indonesian literary works, you will see that the Indonesian represented just by Java side, which is a central of government, which is Jakarta, where the Jakarta is, which is the capital. But I want to give a different perspective. I want to give another view to see Indonesia, because as I said on my paper, Indonesia has so many islands, so many languages, and also built by so many ethnic groups. That's why I think it's so important to give a different view in my works for seeing how Indonesia. At the second point, as a reader, of course, I will catch everything that I can, as much as I can. Of course, for the other culture, I read in the American literature, Europe literature, all the work that I can read, then I can have in Indonesia. I think that's all. Thank you.
I prefer to speak for myself, not as a Venezuelan or a Spanish, I don't know, my mother tongue is Spanish, okay? And when I go to Spain, I feel a stranger. And in my country, I feel as a stranger. And here, of course, and today, of course, I think I have to create my own language, okay? My own expression, my own vision about the problem of what kind of stories I want to tell, or I want to read, or I want to choose, because I feel in every part of the world we are telling the same stories about, I don't know, divorces, smugglers, and the same stories everywhere, okay? I know that human everywhere has or have the same kind of drama, but it's weird that we read the same stories everywhere. I prefer to create my own world.
I'm very interested in your descriptions of how the history of your countries is playing out in the literature and what modern techniques there are. I was wondering how, if there are any things happening in each of your countries that deal with contemporary technologies. I was thinking a little bit about, in Japan, how the Twitter novel came about because Twitter ended up becoming a format and length that really fit with certain historical traditions within Japanese literature, and so a lot of people started writing novels on Twitter there, and a lot of them became quite well known. But I was wondering if, given the contemporary technologies, if there are any things happening in your countries that are really specific or innovative ways that writers are using these things now that really reflect back to your culture itself.
Beyond Facebook poetry, about where the poet talks about, there's the couple that do that, and it's mostly like it draws on these rural associations of, oh, my grandmother told me this, or my grandmother told me that. And that's not innovative. And beyond that, no, there's nothing. We haven't had that kind of breakthrough.
Venezuela, we are eliminating technology, okay? There's no light so many hours a day. And people use Twitter for fight against government and for fight between them. And I think the technology is not the problem, okay? I think the problem is to create stories. And for an artist, for a writer, the problem is to create his or her own world. And the material could be a paper, a piece of paper, or I don't know, a stone, or whatever, or Twitter, okay? 2 or 3 years ago, I came to the United States, and I was wondering about iPods, the iPod culture everywhere. Now I'm in the United States, and I can't find a simple iPod, okay? I mean, today we have Twitter. Maybe tomorrow we don't have Twitter. We have, I don't know, a carpet. Carpet will be the next name of technology or the platform, etc. And Twitter will be something of the past. The content is more important than the material.
So actually, I'm an old-style young writer. I stand so far from technology, even though I use a phone and I use a laptop. But as I said on my paper, mostly my work is about mystical things, about local tradition. So that thing is so far from the technology. I use technology just to promote my books. Thank you.
Hi. I guess you guys, a lot of you have spoken a little bit about this in your pieces that you read and also in conversation, but I'm curious, because literature is so often categorized by country, especially I guess maybe in the US market when we're talking about literature, world literature, I was curious how you personally identify your work geographically, whether it's smaller than the unit of country, for example, Bhutanese, or larger Balkan, or maybe you're interested in completely disavowing the idea of your work being connected to country. So I was curious what your thoughts are on how you categorize or think of your own work.
Who wants to start?
I feel orphan, okay? I speak Spanish, it's my mother tongue, but I don't like the problems that live and float on Spanish. In Spanish, we only speak about the past, socialist ideas and Fidel Castro, wow. I hate it, okay? And Chavez. It's the past, only past. I need a language with a compromise with the future. With future and other words, okay? Another words. I feel orphan in Spanish. And in these days, I'm more orphan in English.
I feel that I have a strong connection to the Yugoslav sphere, and that's probably because my language is very small, and it's also once Yugoslavia fell apart, we became even more isolated. So, and whereas the other countries of ex-Yugoslavia, they mostly speak the same language. They don't say that it's the same, but it's the same. They call it Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin. It's the same language. And our language is different, but we can understand each other if we put in an effort, also the Slovenian. Also, there is this anger about the breakup of Yugoslavia. A lot of us felt that it was nicer to have cultural exchange and to just have this larger area where you could function, where you could travel without borders. And a lot of us are not in the EU, and we feel very isolated. So we've noticed, especially in the art world, that we've created this post-Yugoslav cultural space where we function together because we've gone through a similar history, so we have a lot of connections, but we also have differences which we like to share. So I like to say that I'm part of that Yugoslavia.
Okay. I always wondered that we are living in our separate countries, but we are developing as a human beings in a general world scale. And for the human beings, we are developing our ideologies about so many things, like, okay, racism is not tolerated, or LGBT rights matters, something like that. But I wonder that if I write about this kind of general ideologies which is accepted in modern world, in my own language and my own culture, it is whether it is accepted or not, because I also translate some works from English into Mongolian, and when I translate in a short story by Colm Tobin, who is the openly gay writer, and I was wondering that if I translate this short story and let Mongolians read, what would the older readers comment, say? And I also think that kind of things when I write my works, and it would be accepted in our among our youngsters, but it would be still taboos among our older readers. So there are some difference between the generations. So, okay.
I think I was thinking you have a good question. Go ahead. All right, quick question. Last question. All right, last slow question.
I wanted to ask about the scene, like in the writing of all of you, I guess there are scenes that are untranslatable, untransferable, and cannot be understood correctly without knowing and understanding of the local context. So up to you, where is the border about this, like, as Romana said, stinky globalization and unification, and just writing understandable scenes, understandable to anyone, not only to those who stuck to the local context. Where is the border between this? Does it exist? Thank you. That's the question to all of you.
I'm just quickly going to say that I don't believe in that border, and if I can understand another literature and I can read American literature, let's say, if anybody else could make that effort for another culture, so.
I have no border in my works. That's my answer. The longer answer I will give you in our room.
With a tornado.
In our hotel, I mean. It's two different things.
Anybody else dare to ask a question? I was being a little facetious. I really wanted to make announcements and let everybody go to lunch, because I know that there's some things that start again at 2:30. So a couple things that I want everybody to know are coming up. Beginning this afternoon, Aram Pachian and Eva Pezuashvili are reading tonight at Shambo House at 5 p.m. Please join us then. On Sunday at Prairie Lights, we have a reading featuring two of our writers and a student from one of the MFA programs. Our writers will be Shamila Benye and Dan Coman. Please come for that. We'll have a screening at Adler 105 on Sunday evening, hosted by Iman Al-Yusuf and Haifa Abu Al-Nadi. The films that they will be screening are Iman's short film, Ghafa, and Haifa will be presenting a Jordanian film, Al-Manataf. And I also encourage you to look on university calendars. There's a wonderful translator coming to visit the university next week named Steve Bradbury. He'll be reading at Shambo House on Monday night, and he's got a translation event on Tuesday. The translation event on Tuesday is at noon at Phillips Hall, and the Shambo House reading on Monday is at 7:30. Thank you very much. Give our presenters another hand.